A white woman with her twin babies thought she was safe on the frontier, thought the dust and the heat were the only enemies she had to face. She was wrong. The day the Comanche chief's wife rode into her life was the day she learned what real fear was. But the story doesn't end there. What happened in that camp, under the vast and unforgiving Texas sky, would uncover a secret so dark it threatened to burn everything to the ground. Sarah Miller's world was small, and she liked it that way. It was the creak of the wagon wheels, the smell of dry grass, and the two soft bundles she held tight to her chest. Emma and Elijah, her 6-month-old twins. Her entire world, right there in her arms. Her husband, Thomas, was 3 months gone, chasing furs and fortune in Santa Fe, leaving her with the silence of their homestead and the long, dusty road to her sister's place in Fort Davis. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the canvas wagon top. Just a few more hours, she'd whisper to the babies. Just a little longer. But the frontier doesn't care about plans. It doesn't care about sisters or babies or a husband who's due home soon. The first sign of trouble wasn't a sound. It was a feeling. The horse went rigid, its ears swiveling like compass needles pointing to danger. Sarah's heart slammed against her ribs. She scanned the horizon, a flat, shimmering line of heat and nothingness. Then the sound came. A low rumble that wasn't thunder. Hoofbeats. Fast. Too fast. They crested a small ridge, 6 of them, materializing from the heat haze like ghosts on horseback. Comanche. Their faces were a kaleidoscope of war paint, their hair a blur of feathers and fury. Sarah froze, a rabbit in the path of a hawk. The leader, a man whose presence was as big as the sky, reined in his horse beside her wagon. His eyes, dark and hard as river stones, took in every detail of her fear. "I mean no harm," she stammered, the words tasting like dust in her mouth. "Please. I have children." He didn't seem to understand. Or maybe he just didn't care. He spoke to his men in their own tongue, and their laughter was a harsh, grating sound that made the hairs on her arms stand up. They surrounded the wagon, a closing circle of painted faces and cold eyes. When the leader gestured for her to get down, she hesitated for just a second. It was a second too long. A powerful hand clamped around her arm, pulling her from the wagon seat and onto the hard-packed earth. The twins, startled by the jolt, began to cry. A symphony of terror in the sudden, tense silence. "My babies!" Sarah screamed, scrambling towards them. But 2 of the warriors were already there, lifting them from their basket as if they were curious artifacts. They were so small, so fragile in those powerful, unfamiliar hands. The leader barked an order. Leather straps bit into her wrists, pulling her arms tight behind her back. They threw her onto a horse like a sack of grain. Then, in a gesture of what felt like incredible cruelty, one of the warriors handed her babies back to her. She could hold them, feel their tiny, trembling bodies against her own. But she was helpless to protect them. As they rode away, leaving her wagon and her old life abandoned on the trail, a single, terrifying question echoed in her mind. This wasn't a raid for supplies. They didn't take food or horses. They took her. And they took her children. Why? They rode for what felt like days. The sun a relentless tormentor. The landscape shifted from open plains to rocky canyons, a foreign world she didn't recognize. The twins cried until they had no tears left, finally succumbing to an exhausted sleep against her chest. When night fell, they made camp. Someone untied her hands just enough so she could eat the dry, stringy meat they offered. She tried to ask questions, but the warriors just stared through her, their faces impassive masks. That night, lying on a rough buffalo hide with her babies nestled beside her, Sarah wept. She wept for Thomas, who would return to a home haunted by ghosts. She wept for her sister, who was waiting for a guest that would never arrive. But mostly, she wept for the terrifying uncertainty of the dawn. The next day, they arrived at the village. It was a sprawling collection of teepees and cook fires, a hive of activity that fell silent as they rode in. Every eye was on her, the white woman, the captive. The leader took her directly to the largest teepee, the one adorned with symbols of eagles and lightning. Inside, a woman sat on a pile of rich furs. She was beautiful, with eyes that held the cold fire of a winter star. Her dress was a masterpiece of beadwork, her hair woven with turquoise and silver. This was no ordinary woman. This was the chief's wife. A knot of pure dread tightened in Sarah's stomach. The woman rose and circled her, a predator inspecting its prey. Her gaze lingered on the twins, on their pale skin and wisps of blonde hair, so alien in this place. Then, without warning, she barked a sharp command. 2 warriors seized Sarah, forcing her to her knees. The chief's wife loomed over her, her face a mask of contempt. She spoke again, her voice like cracking ice. 2 other women appeared, and despite Sarah's desperate screams, they pried the babies from her arms. "No, please, don't take my children." The chief's wife didn't flinch. She simply drew back her hand and slapped Sarah across the face. The world exploded in a flash of white-hot pain. The last thing she heard as she was dragged away was the sound of her own children crying, a sound that would echo in her nightmares for a long, long time. The warriors didn't just take her babies. They gave them to the chief's wife. They were a gift. Sarah awoke on a scratchy buffalo robe, the inside of the small teepee hazy in the morning light. Her cheek throbbed, a dull, aching reminder of the day before. But that pain was nothing. A ghost. The real pain was a hollow cavern in her chest, an emptiness where her children should be. They were gone. The teepee flap opened, and a young Comanche woman entered. She carried a bowl of corn porridge and set it on the ground. She didn't meet Sarah's eyes. "My babies," Sarah croaked, her voice raw. "Where are they?" The young woman looked at her then, a flicker of something, pity, maybe, in her dark eyes. "Baby's safe," she said, her English halting, broken. "Chief's wife. Take." The words were both a comfort and a terror, alive. But with her. The woman who had looked at her with such pure hatred. "Why?" Sarah begged. "Why does she want them?" The young woman just shook her head. "Eat. You work soon." She was put to work scraping buffalo hides, a brutal soul-crushing labor that left her hands blistered and bleeding. She worked mechanically, her eyes constantly scanning the camp, searching for any sign of Emma or Elijah. The chief's teepee stood in the center of the village, a silent, imposing fortress. She would catch glimpses of the chief's wife running deer, moving with an air of absolute authority. But she never saw the twins. Days bled into one another, a miserable cycle of work, fear, and a grief so profound it felt like a physical weight. One afternoon, an older woman working beside her, a woman with a face like a dried apple, finally spoke. Her name was Stoneflower. "Running deer." "She lost child," Stoneflower said, her voice a low whisper. "Moon ago. Sickness. Her heart is a stone." The story poured out in a mix of broken English and gestures. Running Deer had a son, a baby boy, and he had died. The grief had broken something inside her. Now Sarah understood. It wasn't just cruelty. It was a desperate, twisted attempt to fill a void. She had taken Sarah's children to replace the one she'd lost, but this knowledge didn't bring comfort. It brought a new kind of fear. A woman who would steal children out of grief. What else was she capable of? What lines would she refuse to cross? That evening, as Stoneflower led Sarah back to her teepee, it happened. A sound cut through the noise of the camp. A sound that shot straight into Sarah's soul. The unmistakable cry of her son, Elijah. It was coming from the chief's teepee. Without thinking, without a single thought for her own safety, she broke away from Stoneflower and ran. She burst through the hide flap, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. And there they were. On a bed of furs, dressed in tiny buckskin clothes, were Emma and Elijah. And kneeling over them was Running Deer. But she wasn't comforting them. She was holding a small, sharp-looking piece of obsidian, its edge glinting in the firelight. And she was holding it over Elijah's face. "My babies!" Sarah screamed, launching herself forward. Running Deer spun around, her eyes blazing with a fury that was almost inhuman. She stood between Sarah and the twins, the obsidian knife still clutched in her hand. She shouted something in her own language, a stream of venomous words. Sarah fell to her knees, pleading, begging. Please, they need me. They need their mother. But Running Deer's face was unyielding. She barked an order, and rough hands grabbed Sarah, dragging her back towards the entrance. Just as they were about to throw her out, a deep voice cut through the chaos. Enough! Everyone froze. Standing in the entrance, silhouetted against the evening sky, was the chief, Eagle Eye. He was tall, imposing, with a face that seemed carved from granite. His eyes missed nothing. He took in the scene: his enraged wife, the crying babies, the terrified captive on the floor. He listened as Running Deer spoke, a torrent of angry, defensive words. When she was finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then, his gaze fell on Sarah. "These... your children?" he asked, his English slow but clear. "Yes," Sarah sobbed. "My twins. Please." He nodded, then turned back to his wife. He spoke to her in a low, firm tone. Whatever he said, it extinguished the fire in her eyes, leaving behind only cold, hard embers. She stepped aside. Sarah crawled to her children, gathering them into her arms, burying her face in their soft hair, inhaling their scent. They quieted instantly, their small bodies molding against hers. It was a reunion so powerful, so raw, that it seemed to suck the air out of the teepee. "You feed," Eagle Eye said, gesturing to the babies. Then, "They return to my wife." Sarah's head snapped up. "No, please, they must stay with me." The chief's expression hardened. "You are prisoner. Children stay with Running Deer. You come feed. 3 times. Sun rises, sun high, sun sets." It was a cruel bargain. A lifeline, but also a leash. She could see them, nourish them, but she couldn't keep them. As she nursed her babies, she could feel Running Deer's eyes on her back, a hateful, possessive glare. And she couldn't shake the image from her mind, the glint of that obsidian knife. What had Running Deer been about to do? A strange and terrible routine began. 3 times a day, Sarah was escorted to the chief's teepee. 3 times a day she would hold her children, nurse them, and whisper promises of escape that she had no idea how to keep. And every time, she had to hand them back to the woman who stared at her with a chilling mix of grief and resentment. Running Deer seemed obsessed with the twins, yet frustrated by them. They cried constantly when Sarah was gone, refusing to be comforted by this strange new mother. One afternoon, Sarah entered the teepee to find Running Deer looking utterly defeated. Emma was wailing, her small face red and blotchy. "They no sleep," Running Deer said. The first words she had spoken directly to Sarah in English. "Cry all night. Want... mother." Sarah took her babies, and as always, they settled in her arms. "They're just young," Sarah said softly, trying to bridge the chasm of hatred between them. "They need their mother." Running Deer watched, her expression unreadable. After a long silence, she spoke. "My son, Jumping Fox. He was strong. Then, sickness." Her voice cracked. "I was not strong enough. Could not save him." For the first time, Sarah saw not a monster, but a grieving mother. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she said, and she meant it. The sincerity seemed to catch Running Deer off guard. Her shoulders slumped. "Eagle Eye. He say we not keep babies forever. Say it is wrong." Hope, fierce and sudden, flared in Sarah's chest. "Will you let us go?" Running Deer's head snapped up, the hardness returning to her eyes. "No. You still prisoner." She paused, then seemed to force the next words out. "But maybe. Babies stay with mother. At night." It wasn't freedom, but it was a victory. A small piece of her life given back. That night, as she lay in her own teepee with Emma and Elijah sleeping soundly beside her, Stoneflower came to her. "Running Deer is changing," the old woman whispered. "She sees the bond, the mother spirit in you." Stoneflower's eyes were shrewd. "The chief sees it too. He watches everything. He is thinking much about the white woman and her twin babies." This was new. The chief was not just a passive observer. He was judging her. And for the first time, Sarah wondered if her fate, and the fate of her children rested not with the grieving wife, but with the silent, watchful chief. But then she remembered the obsidian knife, and a cold dread washed over her. It wasn't just about a mother's grief. There was something else going on, something she didn't understand, something dangerous. The next morning, the chief himself came for her. Eagle Eye stood before her as she worked, his shadow falling over the hide she was scraping. "You come," he said. It wasn't a request. Panic seized her. She looked at the twins, sleeping nearby in a cradleboard Stoneflower had made. "Babies stay," he said, his voice flat. "You come alone." He led her away from the camp, down a winding path to a secluded creek. 2 horses were tethered there. Was he going to kill her, set her free? Her mind raced, a whirlwind of terrifying possibilities. He gestured for her to sit on a rock. He stood over her, his arms crossed, his gaze intense. "You have husband?" he asked. "Yes," she breathed. "Thomas Miller. This husband. He searches for you now." It wasn't a question. I think so. He would never give up." Eagle Eye nodded slowly. "Many white men, when Comanche take family, they come with soldiers, with guns." He looked directly at her, his eyes like polished jet. "Your man. He will come with guns?" Sarah thought of Thomas, of his steady nature, his respect for the tribes he traded with. "He would want peace first," she said. "He speaks some of your words." Eagle Eye's expression didn't change, but a new light flickered in his eyes. "What his name again?" "Thomas Miller." A flicker of recognition crossed the chief's face. Tall man, hair like fire. Sarah's heart stopped. "Yes, that's him. Do you know him?" "I have traded with this Thomas Miller," Eagle Eye said. "He was a fair man." Relief washed over Sarah in a dizzying wave. He knew Thomas. He respected him. "This changes things," the chief said, looking off towards the mountains. "Taking a good trader's family. This is not honorable." "Does that mean you'll let us go?" she whispered, hardly daring to breathe. His gaze returned to her, and it was as cold as a winter morning. Not simple. He explained that Running Deer's grief was a powerful force in the tribe, that to simply return the babies would shame her. He needed a way for her to save face. "I will think on this," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You wait. Be a good mother. Work well." He led her back to the camp, her mind reeling with this new, fragile hope. But as they approached, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Running Deer was standing outside her teepee, holding Elijah. She was rocking him gently, humming a low, mournful song. The baby wasn't crying. He was staring up at her, his little hand gripping one of her beaded necklaces. The look on Running Deer's face was no longer one of grief or anger. It was love. A fierce, possessive love that was terrifying to behold. Stoneflower appeared at Sarah's side, her presence a small comfort. "Be careful," the old woman murmured. "Chief is a good man, but his wife's spirit is strong. She is losing her heart to the boy child." Sarah watched, her newfound hope shriveling. Running Deer had found her replacement son, and she would not give him up easily. But there was something more. As Running Deer shifted the baby in her arms, his tiny buckskin shirt rode up, exposing the skin of his back. And there, just above his hip, was a small crescent-shaped birthmark. Sarah had kissed that little mark 1,000 times. But when Running Deer saw it, her eyes widened, her humming stopped. She stared at the birthmark with an intensity that chilled Sarah to the bone. She said a single word in her own language, a word that sounded like a prayer, or a curse. Stoneflower's breath hitched. "What is it?" Sarah whispered. "What did she say?" The old woman wouldn't look at her. "Truth will come," she said, her voice strained. "The spirits will show the truth." That night, Sarah didn't sleep. The image of Running Deer's face, her shock and strange reverence as she looked at Elijah's birthmark, was burned into her mind. This was no longer about a grieving mother. This was something else. A secret she was not a part of. A story that had begun long before she ever arrived. and she and her children were now trapped in the middle of it. The tension in the camp became a living thing, a predator stalking the spaces between the teepees. Running Deer's behavior towards Sarah shifted. The open hostility was gone, replaced by something far more unsettling. A watchful, calculating intensity. She would bring gifts to Sarah's teepee, a warm fur for the babies, a sweet berry paste for Sarah to eat. But her eyes were always fixed on Elijah. She would touch the baby's crescent birthmark with a strange reverence, whispering words in her own tongue. "What does she say?" Sarah asked Stoneflower one afternoon. The old woman looked uneasy. "She speaks of a prophecy," she said reluctantly, "an old story, of a child marked by the moon who will restore what was lost." Sarah felt a chill despite the heat. "But he's my son. He's not part of any prophecy." Stoneflower just shook her head. "She believes what she needs to believe." The balance of power had shifted. Sarah was no longer just a captive. She was the mother of a child who, in Running Deer's grief-stricken mind, was a sacred symbol. But this new status was a gilded cage. She was watched constantly. She was never left alone with the twins. Running Deer was always there, a silent, smiling shadow. Sarah felt like she was losing her mind. She would wake up in the middle of the night to find Running Deer standing at the entrance of her teepee, just watching the babies sleep. One night, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. "He is my son," she said, her voice shaking but firm. Running Deer's smile never faltered. "The spirits gave him the moon's mark," she replied in her slow, careful English. "They sent him to me, to our people." The calm certainty in her voice was more terrifying than any threat. She truly believed it. Then, one morning, a scout rode into camp, his horse lathered, and his face grim. He spoke urgently to Eagle Eye, his words sending a ripple of alarm through the village. Warriors began to gather, their faces hardening. Women started packing supplies, their movements quick and efficient. "What is it?" Sarah asked Stoneflower, her heart pounding. The old woman's face was grave. "White men," she said. "Soldiers. Coming this way." Thomas. It had to be Thomas. He had found them. But the relief that should have flooded her was choked by a new, terrible fear. The Comanche were preparing for battle. The arrival of soldiers wouldn't be a rescue. It would be a massacre. She had to get to Eagle Eye. She had to make him understand. With Stoneflower running interference, she pushed her way to the center of the camp where the chief was issuing orders. "Chief Eagle Eye!" she called out. He turned, his face a thundercloud. "You must not fight," she pleaded. "My husband, Thomas Miller, he will want to talk. He is a man of peace." A warrior beside the chief sneered. "Peace comes from the barrel of a white man's gun." Running Deer appeared at her husband's side. Her eyes were alight with a strange, feverish fire. "It is the prophecy," she declared, her voice ringing with conviction. "The Moonchild has brought our enemies to us, so that we may destroy them and be strong again." The warriors roared in approval. Sarah's blood ran cold. Running Deer was twisting the situation, using her delusion about Elijah to incite a war. Eagle Eye looked from his wife's ecstatic face to Sarah's terrified one. He saw the warriors, hungry for a fight, and he saw the women and children, whose lives would be the price of that fight. He was trapped between his wife's prophecy and Sarah's plea for peace. "I will see these men," he said finally, his voice cutting through the noise. "But we will be ready for a battle." He turned to Sarah, his eyes hard. "You will come with me. If your husband is there, you will speak to him. You will tell him the price of your life, and the lives of your children, is peace. But if you are lying, if this is a trap, you will be the first to die." They rode out to meet the soldiers, a small party of 5 warriors, the chief, and Sarah. She was mounted behind Eagle Eye, his arm like an iron bar across her waist. She was a shield, a hostage, a bargaining chip. They stopped on a ridge overlooking the plains. In the distance, a column of blue-coated soldiers and a single civilian rider advanced under a cloud of dust. Eagle Eye handed her a looking-glass. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold it steady. But she saw him. The fiery red hair, the determined set of his shoulders. Thomas. He was alive. He was here. As the two groups approached each other on the flat plain, the air crackled with tension. Thomas's face, when he saw her, was a canvas of shock, relief, and anguish. "Sarah!" he yelled, starting to dismount. "The children are safe," she called back, her voice thick with unshed tears. Eagle Eye rode forward. "Thomas Miller," he said, his voice carrying across the distance. "You come in peace, or you come for war?" The army captain beside Thomas answered, "We've come for the woman and children, Chief. How we get them is up to you." But Thomas held up a hand. "Chief Eagle Eye, I have come for my family. I will trade for them. I will do whatever it takes." Eagle Eye was silent for a moment. Then he looked at Sarah, and then back at Thomas. "Your wife says you are a man of peace. But there is a debt between us that must be paid. A debt of blood." Thomas looked confused. "I don't understand." "The sickness," Eagle Eye said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "The sickness that took my son. It came to our village a week after you traded blankets with us last season. Blankets from your wagon." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Thomas's face went white. The captain looked from the chief to Thomas, his hand moving to rest on the butt of his pistol. This wasn't a negotiation over a captive. This was an accusation of murder. And the trial was about to begin, right here, in the middle of the unforgiving Texas plains, with two armies ready to unleash hell at a single word. Thomas was speechless. He stared at Eagle Eye, the accusation hanging between them, heavier than the humid air. He had traded blankets, yes. Dozens of them. They were his main commodity. But the idea that they had carried a sickness, it was unthinkable. "Chief," he stammered, "I swear on my wife's life, on my children's lives, I would never. I had no idea." The captain beside him scoffed. "Don't listen to him, Miller. It's a trick. A savage's lie to justify their raid." Eagle Eye's gaze, which had been fixed on Thomas, shifted to the captain. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. "The white soldier is quick to speak of lies," the chief said, his voice dangerously soft. "Perhaps he speaks from experience." He turned back to Thomas. "Your words are easy, but my son is in the ground. My wife's heart is broken. Your apology does not fill his empty cradle." Sarah, still held fast in front of the chief, felt a tremor run through his body, a tightly coiled rage. She had to do something. "Thomas," she cried out, "tell him about your partner. The new man from St. Louis, the one you said you didn't trust." Thomas's head snapped up. His eyes widened as a memory surfaced. Jacob Reed. A slick, fast-talking merchant who had sold him a wagon-load of goods, including the blankets, for a price that was almost too good to be true. Reed had been in a hurry, eager to get rid of the stock and move west. Thomas had thought it was strange at the time, but he'd been blinded by the profit. "Jacob Reed," Thomas said, the name tasting like poison. "He sold me the blankets. I never traded with him before. He said they were from an army surplus." The captain suddenly went very still. "What did you say the name was?" he asked Thomas, his voice sharp. "Jacob Reed. Why?" The captain stared at Eagle Eye, a look of dawning horror on his face. He addressed the chief directly. "We've been hunting a man named Reed for months. He worked as a civilian contractor at Fort Larned, where there was a smallpox outbreak. He stole medical supplies and a shipment of contaminated blankets from the infirmary before deserting his post. We thought he'd gone to California." The silence that followed was absolute. The wind whispered through the dry grass, carrying a truth so ugly, so monstrous, it stole the breath from every man there. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a tragic twist of fate. It was a deliberate act of extermination, a biological weapon unleashed for profit by a man without a soul. And Thomas, unknowingly, had been his delivery man. Eagle Eye's face was a mask of stone, but his eyes were blazing. The honor of the trade had been a lie. He had welcomed a man into his camp who, however innocently, had brought a plague that had stolen his only son. He had taken that man's wife and children in an act of grief-stricken revenge, only to find out the crime was infinitely worse than he could have ever imagined. The target of his rage had been in the wrong place all along. He looked at Thomas, and for the first time, he saw not an enemy, but another victim of Reed's poison. He looked at Sarah, held captive before him, and he saw the terrible, tangled knot of their shared fate. Then he spoke a single word to one of his warriors. "Ride." The warrior wheeled his horse around and galloped back towards the Comanche camp. No one knew what the order was. Was it a signal to attack? A command to bring the children? The soldiers shifted nervously, their rifles held a little tighter. Thomas looked at Sarah, his face a mess of guilt and despair. This was his fault. His greed, his willingness to trust the wrong man, had led to all of this. He had not only lost his family, but had been an instrument of death to the very people he prided himself on trading with fairly. He was a murderer in their eyes, a monster. There was no trade that could fix this, no apology that could bridge this chasm of blood. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, 2 riders appeared from the direction of the camp. It was the warrior Eagle Eye had sent, and beside him, on her own horse, was Running Deer. She was carrying a cradle board on her back. As they drew closer, Sarah could see the twins, their faces shaded from the sun. Running Deer rode directly to her husband's side, her eyes fixed on Thomas with an unreadable expression. There was no rage there anymore, just a vast, empty landscape of sorrow. She had heard the news. She understood what had happened. Eagle Eye spoke to her in their own language, his voice low and gentle. She listened, then nodded. She looked at Sarah, a long, searching look that passed between 2 mothers who had both, in different ways, lost everything. Then, Running Deer did something that stunned everyone into silence. She nudged her horse forward towards Thomas. She stopped right in front of him. With slow, deliberate movements, she unslung the cradle board from her back. She held it out to him. "You did not know," she said, her English heavy with an accent Sarah had never heard her use before. It was the language of someone who understood far more than she let on. "The man with the poison heart. He is the enemy, not you." She pushed the cradle board into Thomas's trembling hands. "You take," she said. "You go. Find this man. Let his blood be the water that washes the ground clean." It wasn't forgiveness. It was a sentence. A quest for vengeance that was now Thomas's to complete. Eagle Eye watched the exchange, then addressed the captain. "Our fight is not with you. It is with the man named Reed. We will hunt him. If you find him first, you will hold him for us. This is the only way for peace." The captain, humbled by the raw justice of the moment, could only nod. "You have my word, Chief." Sarah was released. She slid from the chief's horse and ran to Thomas, to her children. She touched their faces, their hands, assuring herself they were real, they were safe. When she looked up, she saw Running Deer watching her, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. "He has the moon's mark," Running Deer whispered, looking at Elijah. Perhaps the prophecy was not about revenge. Perhaps it was about truth. The ride home was quiet. The soldiers kept a respectful distance. Thomas held the cradle board, his eyes rarely leaving his children's faces. Sarah rode beside him, her hand resting on his arm. They were free. They were together. But they were not the same people who had been separated weeks before. They were bound by a new, darker knowledge of the world, and by a promise made in the shadow of death. They had their family back, but they had a debt to pay. A debt of blood. Their journey wasn't over. In a strange and terrible way, it was just beginning. What do you think happened to Jacob Reed? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales from the strange and mysterious corners of the world, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching.